There are a lot of misconceptions surrounding the paleo diet. In fact there are a lot of variants on it, some better than others, meaning that the efficacy and health impacts of some are going to be different from others. Let's see if we can at least parse out some of the obvious BS and sift out what actually makes sense. Before I get into that, I think it might be useful to talk briefly about science and some of the ways people use and or misuse that word. Science is an ongoing process of evaluation, experimentation, and even imagination. When people say things like, science has proven, or according to science, or this is scientific, that can sometimes be a heads up that you're about to hear something not fully trustworthy. Science, by its very nature, is ongoing. One discovery leads to new questions. Established ideas get displaced by new information. Enlarged views of the universe can reveal questions nobody ever even thought to ask. The world of nutrition is lousy with claims of things that are scientifically proven or very scientific or based on science, and that should set off your BS detector. Now, just so as to not bury the lead, I'm going to give you my bottom line assessment of the paleo diet, which is largely true of a lot of the well-known diets represented in your local bookstore, and that is this. If you're currently eating a less than optimal diet, or what's commonly called the standard American diet, then the paleo diet is probably an improvement, so long as you can stick with it. Whatever diet you choose for yourself, sticking to it might be the most important thing, but in my opinion, there are a few flaws in the paleo view. It's a not at all bad way to eat, but there are some ways in which it does fly in the face of, please pardon the term, science. In looking into the paleo diet, I found a fair share of people making stuff up that isn't supported by the archaeological record. In all fairness, it could be argued that the entire field of paleoanthropology has its share of people making stuff up, but generally it's grounded in solid scientific research, disinterested study, and fair-minded arguments, whereas a lot of the popular books on the so-called ancestral diet are just speculation on the part of people who are not scientists, meaning they start with a conclusion and try to build the supporting evidence around it, which is blatant anathema to the scientific method. Now, ironically, the most ironic thing about the so-called paleo diet is that there are a lot of variations of it. Dozens of books are on the shelf with hundreds of ways to interpret them. This is ironic because that's also true of the way our ancestors actually ate. Just as there isn't one paleo diet on the bookshelf, there was no such thing as one ancestral diet. Now think about it. For starters, few of these authors even seem to agree on when exactly the paleo era took place. Archaeologists often peg it as long ago as 3 million years ago. Some nutritionists say 200,000 years ago. Others put it more like 35,000 years ago. One YouTuber describes it as our caveman diet from our hunter-gatherer days of 2 million years ago, which is a crock of a load of a bunch of a pile of... That's a huge time span, and that would include at least 4 or 5 different human species, all with different nutritional needs and living in environments as diverse as tropical rainforests to Arctic tundras. Another claim is that this is not a fad diet because it's how we've eaten forever, except that its current iteration is only about 10 years old, so suffice it to say that many of the principles people are offering are historically inaccurate. Now, even if you decide to say we're only going to count the Homo sapiens from 300,000 years ago to 10,000-ish years ago, that's still an impossibly diverse number of life ways and food ways. People living in a humid, hot rainforest were probably eating more of the fruit that was just there for the taking, rather than running through the hot, bug-infested jungle past stores of fruit because you must only eat the muscle meat from the much faster monkey who is far better equipped to move through the branches and vines. The animals you're more likely to eat in that environment are the ones with 6 legs anyway, don't you think? I mean, sure, they ate monkeys, of course they did, but they probably ate a lot more fruit and bugs. Now contrast that to people living in the far north, where there's comparatively little plant life. You're going to make your living on the animal herds who will not only provide protein and fat to eat, but also skins to wear and bones to build with. The foodways of Siberians are going to be completely different from the foodways of Africans and different again from the Europeans, and there's no logical way around that fact. What you should be taking away from this by now is that we're not adapted to be carnivores. We're not adapted to be vegetarians. We're adapted to adapt. The remarkable thing about our species and the very reason that we were able to become the dominant mammal on this planet is that we are versatile and adaptable, and that is our superpower. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors hunted and gathered, okay? They ate animals and plants. You really couldn't afford to be precious back then. I mean, can you imagine spending 3 days without food and then turning your nose up at some apples because, oh, I'm sorry, I'm on the carnivore diet. Are these monkey brains pasture-raised? I mean, come on. Wow. As for claims that our ancestors didn't eat grains or gluten or beans or legumes, that's just flat wrong. There is archaeological evidence for our eating all of those things, and the same is true for our Neanderthal cousins. Yes, cousins. Yeah, I said that right. You hear some people in the paleo community mistakenly referring to the Neanderthals as our ancestors, but that just ain't so. We did not descend from them. We both split off from a common ancestor, Homo erectus. Probably. It may have been Heidelbergensis, or maybe both, or maybe the Homo denisovans. There were yet a third cousin, and oh my God, it can get so crazy because paleoanthropology is a complex and fascinating discipline. Just know that we did not descend from the Neanderthals, and people who say we did are making stuff up, and you would do well to doubt them. What we can say is that we are descended from people who lived in nearly every terrestrial ecosystem on the planet over a span of 300 millennia. There simply is no one diet that all those ancestors ate. Even if there were, most of our ancestors didn't live terribly long. Evolution doesn't care if you're healthy in your dotage. It only cares if you pass on your genes, so even if you lived to 30, hey, good for you, but evolution didn't care if you were a healthy 30-something. There's something called antagonistic pleiotropy. That means some nutrients and genes can be beneficial in one age, but may not be useful later in life. As for me, I'm 60 and with no kids, so evolution has no use for me. So I have to make my own selfish choices for my own selfish self, so how do I do that? Well, certainly not by emulating a 25-year-old on the African savannah who has very different needs and goals and objectives from mine. Luckily, what I do have is, yeah, I'm going to say it, I have science. Scientific research, while hardly complete, does have sufficient evidence to suggest that there are some foods healthier than others and that those needs may change as I age. But I digress. Let's get back to the paleo blah blah blah. Some people mistakenly think that the paleo diet is mostly, if not exclusively, meat. If you look at the original paleo diet as first described by Lauren Cordain of CSU right here in Colorado, you'll find that it recommends nuts and other plant foods. What it recommends against are foods that he supposed weren't available to our primal ancestors, such as dairy, grains, and legumes, but that doesn't fully make sense to me. For instance, pretty much none of the foods in your grocery store was available 200,000 years ago. Broccoli didn't exist. Carrots as we know them didn't exist. I pretty much guarantee you that none of the boxed meals with paleo plastered on the label existed. Even muscle meat was not preferred since it was harder to digest and harder to obtain, so people had a strong preference for organs, including the brains and bone marrow. Marrow, by the way, had the very cool benefit of lasting a long time. Since it's encased inside of a bone, it takes longer to spoil, so we could keep it for much longer than muscle meat or liver. That marrow is high in fat, and fat is the real prize in animal foods. This may be disturbing, but it seems like fat content led us to preferring female animals, and particularly if they were pregnant, and yes, we ate everything, and that one kind of bothers me, to be honest. Protein is great, of course, but it can be found in a lot of non-animal sources. Fat, on the other hand, is much harder to come by, so we always wanted bones and brains whenever they were available. And here's a surprise. You know what else was available? Grains. Yes, grains. Think about it. If we started planting grains around 10,000 years ago, and supposedly that's what ruined everything, let me ask you this. How did we know? If we weren't eating grains before then, how did we know to start planting them? It makes no sense. We had to have been eating grains before we started planting them. We wouldn't have planted them if we didn't already know that they were food. Don't believe me? Then explain to me why archaeologists have found actual grinding stones with remnants of grains and gluten in them. We were definitely eating grains. Now, you'll never hear me say that all of the paleo diets out there are unhealthy. In fact, I think that a lot of them, while of somewhat dubious antecedents, have a lot to offer. If you're a person looking to make a change and start eating better, you could do a lot worse than using paleo as a solid starting point. It is pretty solid in a lot of ways, but it might be helpful to remember that the so-called history a lot of them describe is mostly bunk. If you want to eat paleo, great, but don't go around thinking that this is the diet of our ancestors because such a thing could not have existed. Still, I think generally there are worse ways to go, and paleo can make an okay starting point for someone who wants to learn how to eat healthy. I agree wholeheartedly with some of the basic concepts that modern food production, marketing, and distribution have had a deleterious impact on the nutrition of produce, that CAFO meat is nutritionally compromised, that whole foods are vastly superior to the ultra-processed food-like substances in the stores. But a lot of paleo I've read and heard is based on a faulty interpretation of human history. Put another way, the diet described by paleonutritionists is completely different from what I hear from actual paleoanthropologists. The actual data from real scientists is contrary to what some of the foodies claim. The foodies are just making stuff up. Do not trust foodie YouTubers to be the final arbiters of solid nutritional advice. There are different versions of the paleo diet, and some are more errant than others, but what they all seem to have in common is a completely fallacious image of how our prehistoric ancestors lived and ate. In a way, it doesn't really matter, because I don't necessarily agree with the supposition that a prehistoric diet is the best one for me anyway. Given that, it shouldn't matter if the paleo people are truly telling me what humans ate. Still, be advised on this one point. The diets that a lot of paleo books described are not what our ancestors ate. It doesn't mean it's not a good diet. It just means that many, if not most, dietitians have a poor understanding of early human history. The paleo diet is based on something called the discordance hypothesis, which suggests that many modern diseases are caused by the fact that we eat differently now than we did in the supposed paleo era. It overlooks a few important points, starting with the fact that we also lived very differently back then before anyone had desk jobs. It overlooks the fact that there was no imperative to live past your reproductive years. It overlooks the fact that we have no way to conduct comparative population studies on people who have been dead for tens of thousands of years. A lot of people say that the paleo diet emphasizes a focus on meat and animal products. To be fair, it seems like the more credible versions of paleo disagree with this notion, but just to check this point off the list, early people ate a lot of plants. This is supported first by plain common sense. If you're a hunter-gatherer, you're going to eat the food that doesn't run away and doesn't fight back. Also, some of their poop has actually survived the millennia and has been studied by scientists who found that at least one population of early Homo sapiens was eating about 75% plants. There's also a technique called dental calculus, where we can study the plaque left on the teeth of people's remains, which tells us what they were eating. And depending on where and when they lived, a lot of them were eating a lot of plants, including grains and beans and gluten. Yes, gluten. One thing they were not eating was a carefully constructed paleo diet from a book. Books that offer actual measurements of grams and calories of what our ancestors ate are completely fabricated. There's no actual science there, just speculation, as we just don't have any evidence. Can we determine how many daily grams of saturated fat someone ate 30,000 years ago, or make a detailed mathematical inventory of how many long-chain fatty acids were in their diet? No. No, we cannot. And anyone who says they can is wackadoodle. That's the scientific word for it, wackadoodle. When you look at the pictures in some of those books, they are almost comical. There's this incessant hypermasculinity plastered all over the place with pictures of bananas and olive oil and avocados and things that simply did not exist in the African savanna. Chocolate, processed food, broccoli, mayo, modern lettuce, meat snacks wrapped in plastic, all served up by a freshly waxed Caucasian bodybuilder. I mean, the marketing is out of control. As for those marketing pictures that feature big, juicy steaks, that's not what was usually on the menu. Most of the animals early humans ate were small, and the preferred cuts were the organ meat and the marrow. I guess someone on the marketing team decided that they wouldn't sell as many books if they showed people gobbling up a big plate of raw squirrel kidneys or sucking the marrow out of a half-eaten scavenged reindeer femur. It's understandable when you think about it. It's also evident in our evolution that we are adapted for digesting plants. For one, we have a long intestinal tract, which is well suited for digesting them. It's worth mentioning that as our brains got bigger, our guts got smaller. But even modern humans have guts that are good for digesting plants. For two, all carnivores have specialized teeth, while our teeth are better for dietary generalists. Carnivore teeth are good at ripping. Vegetarian teeth are good at grinding. We have a kind of a mouthful of all-purpose chompers. Our teeth are specifically designed to eat whatever. We also have the ability to see red and green, which carnivores do not. The reason red and green are useful is because they help us identify leaves and ripe fruits. Carnivores have no need for that. We also have amylase enzymes in our saliva that are designed for turning starch into sugar. This is only useful if you're eating plants, and there have been 3 times in human evolution when our amylase enzyme expanded. In other words, there were at least 3 times where it was advantageous for us to process starch better, and there ain't no starch in a ribeye. We also lost our ability to make vitamin C, which means that we had to have been getting it from our diet. Now, there is some vitamin C in organ meat, yes, but fruit is loaded with this stuff. So when the weather and geography allowed, we were nuts for fruit. But that's another problem. Not only were we traveling all across the globe during our migrations, we were also traveling through time when numerous shifts in the climate came and went, each one causing profound changes in our foodways. I just can't buy the notion that there was one diet that humans ate consistently for 250,000 years through numerous changes in the climate while wandering through nearly every kind of ecosystem ranging from Alaska to Ecuador. Suffice to say that a person in a tropical jungle is going to eat a lot of fruit that doesn't run away. A person living in a tundra is going to eat pretty much only animals because there just isn't much in the way of plants up there. So, which one of these populations ate the real paleo diet? The people of the coastal regions of Africa 115,000 years ago who lived mostly on shellfish? Or the people hunting horses along the Don River around 30,000 years ago? I'm sorry, but that's beyond absurd. They all had their own ways of making a living, and those lifeways were in a constant state of change with the literal weather. The simple fact that humans migrated to all corners of the world means that they could not have been dietary specialists. Otherwise, every time they moved from one area to another, they'd be without their supposed optimal foods. They had to be adaptable, meaning that they had to find calories wherever they could, whether they be from horses or fruits or fish or leaves. The fossil record does indicate a lot of hunting, but it overemphasizes meat and underemphasizes plants because bones preserve better than plants. Cut marks on a leg bone can stay intact for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, but a half-eaten strawberry will hardly make it through spring. As for those bones, some of them have both cut marks from humans as well as gnaw marks from carnivores. It's hardly questionable that we hunted and scavenged and gathered, but it's almost impossible to tell how much of each. Ethnographic observations, as flawed as they can be, indicate that it's largely a matter of environment and that we are and always have been opportunists first and foremost. In fact, here's your favorite new word. We engaged in kleptoparasitism, which is a fancy way of saying that we stole food from smaller carnivores. Hey, nice bunny rabbit, Mr. Bobcat. Why don't you let me help you finish that? Speaking of sharing and ethnographic studies, it's been noted that our old friends, the Hadza, who still practice their ancient hunter-gatherer lifestyle in Tanzania, only harvest animals successfully about 3% of their attempts, and even then, they often share the meat only among the hunters. Now that actually puts us ahead of the curve. We're actually the only primate who collectively acquires and then shares food at all. So we can let the Hadza off the hook for not always sharing their kill. It's kind of a shitty thing to do, but like I said, we're opportunists. And as opportunists, we did eat grains and legumes if that's what was around, and ants, and caterpillars, and honey, and everything, which includes, everything. Grass seeds? Oh, no thanks. I'm doing the gluten-free thing. I figure if I can stay with it, I might be like at least 22, maybe 25. Actually, we know very little about the lifespan of early humans. There just aren't enough remains to determine. A few have been found who outlived their teeth or had atrophied bones, so at least some did live to an old age, but what we know about most hunter-gatherer humans kind of depends. There's one fossil skull I've heard referred to as Gummy Joe, who lost all of his teeth except for one, and clearly lived like that for a long time. What's kind of heartwarming is that his clan must have been taking care of him. What's kind of gross is that someone was probably chewing his food up for him. It was a different time. Even if we could determine that many of our primal ancestors lived to an old age, that wouldn't be all that compelling because it's a person's whole lifestyle you have to consider, including their social and familial fabric. Well, that and your willingness to eat pre-masticated squirrel kidneys. Paleoanthropology is a dynamic discipline. You can hardly say one thing before some new information comes along and changes everything. This script was written just a few days before the video dropped, but it's entirely possible that half of what I just said is already outdated. So when people speak definitively about how our ancestors ate, you need to take that with a grain of salt because even the world's leading experts are still trying to unravel that. What we can say with a fair amount of certainty is that if there is one defining trait to the diet of our primal ancestors, it's adaptability and diversity. We changed what we ate constantly. There was no single paleo diet, and that much is certain. And it's the reason why to this day, there is probably no one correct diet, period. It's our adaptability that has always made us who we are. Most paleo diets out there aren't really half bad. They focus on whole foods, pastured meat, and minimizing processed junk, and you can do a lot worse than that. It's just the pseudoscience that alarms me because it can cost them a lot of credibility. Okay, but what about the fact that metabolic syndrome seems to be a modern phenomenon? Well, there are a lot of people a lot smarter than I am looking into that as I speak, but some have suggested that it wasn't the agricultural revolution so much as it was the industrial revolution that messed things up. The introduction, for instance, of chemically separated ultra-processed food with a focus on commodity crops and our current stressed-out lifestyle are probably huge factors. People who live urban lifestyles also have substantially less diverse microbiota in their guts. Personally, I would look to those things first. I'll be making some videos about the Industrial Revolution really soon. But for now, it's time to wrap up this video. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you next time. Ciao.